high school in New York City and got a certificate in electrical certificate. I was hired by Bell Laboratories in New York because of my training, and I worked there for quite a while, testing dynamotors for the Army and Navy. These were devices that changed the DC current to 400 cycles for the telephone and communication, not telephone, but communications in the airplanes and tanks. I was deferred from drafting for quite a while because of important work, but early in 1943, I realized this was not going to last and I should get into the service, so I found out about a very special program that was going on. Nobody would tell us much about it, but the sergeant who I talked to said, recommended that I join the Signal Corps Reserves, and they would send me to NYU University, New York University in New York City, and get for an electronic course. There were 4 of us that did this, and we were called up, and I was called up in September of '43, and I got basic training out in Camp Crowder, and I was trained as a pole line construction work, and I thought, well, here's the end of that. I wasn't going to get into this special program, but about the time we were ready to go overseas, I was called into the captain's office, and he wondered who in the world I knew. I was going to New York City, so good. I was in this program, which was the 805th Signal Service Company. I went back to New York and went through a school that was given by Bell Laboratories. The Bell Laboratories engineers actually were the only ones that knew anything about it because of the secrecy. And they did all the training for about half a year until some 805th people learned about the equipment and could do the training down in Washington. Well, that was about six weeks, I think, course. And after that, I was attached to some work. We did some making the key for the program on tapes, but I can explain that later. I went down to Washington and was there for a while until I was assigned with 2 others to go to Hawaii for the detachment in Hawaii. Incidentally, there were 12 stations throughout the world, and one was in London, and another well, 2 were in Washington. One was in the Pentagon originally, and another was supposed to be put into the White House. But this equipment was about 20 consoles, about 7 feet high and about 16 feet wide, and they had no room for it, so they put that in the Pentagon also. The one in London was put in the sub-basement of a department store with the safety circuit going over to Churchill's underground bunker, and he had well, if you wanted to go over there to London, you can see where this the equipment is right now. It's still a telephone in a little office, very small office, and it's a very special telephone, but this is where Churchill spent a lot of time using the equipment. Now that I kind of mentioned, let's see, what should I go by next? You want to stop for a minute? What should we talk? Another good reason for trying to get a system like this, before we entered the war, but the English were fighting it, Churchill and Roosevelt talked a lot over private lines. Now these private lines were not secure, and later on we found out, the Army found out that the Germans were tapping in on it and knew everything they said, and it went directly to Hitler. So when we found out about this, Churchill and Roosevelt and General Marshall, who was very worried about this for a long time, decided something had to be done. So they went to Bell Laboratories, and they knew Bell Laboratories were doing some work for voice frequency signaling and so on, and that sort of fed into this Sig Sauer business company, business equipment. Let's see, where stop it. Now, another good reason for having a secure system like this was Pearl Harbor. We knew something was going to happen because our country, and I think it was Canada, had already broken the code for the Japanese code, the code purple, and they announced that the attack was going to happen, and they even said when it was going to happen, but they didn't say where, so nobody knew where it was going to be except the Japanese, of course. So Marshall could not send this information to the commanders in Hawaii, because if he did over our non-secure lines, the Japanese would hear it and say, hey, they've been listening to our code, so we'll have to change the code. So even though it might have saved some lives in Pearl Harbor, in the long run it saved many lives by not letting the Japanese know we knew their code all through the war. And that saved many, many lives. So that was another reason to go ahead with the construction on this equipment, or building of it. The building, Bell Laboratories designed it, and Western Electric built it, and all in New York City. And there were 12 terminals built, and one went to London. I think I said that right.
Yes.
You can scratch that. Now, I was assigned to the terminal in Hawaii, and each terminal had, the complement was very high. It was one of the highest groups in the service. It composed of a captain, 4 lieutenants, 5 master sergeants, and 5 tech sergeants, and that's all. That was it. And we all were well trained. We were picked by because of working for the telephone companies and communications, and it was very. We had to have a top secret clearance by the FBI, and I almost didn't get in because my grandparents on my mother's side came from the German-speaking part of Switzerland. I was rejected, actually, but they went back and said, try it again, so I did get in, thank goodness. And altogether there were about 81 officers and 250 sergeants throughout the 805th Signal Service Company, one of the highest ratings in the services. That's about two sergeants to one officer, and that was pretty unusual. Now the system had the secret of the system had big, large 26-inch phonograph machines built by Western Electric Company, and the tapes were. Stop it. Did I tell you about what made this system secret and unbreakable? It was the only unbreakable code used during the war by anyone. But it was a record, large records, 26-inch records, and each record lasted about 12 minutes. These records had white noise, just clear white noise, and the voice signals, when someone was talking into it, were broken up into 12 different channels, and a special telephone was used for that. And each channel was bumped against a section of noise from the record so many times a minute. There are 50 times a second, 50 times a second. So all 12 channels, that means there are about 600 changes. But what happened, the voice was cut, just a slice of the voice, and that was bounced against a slice of the noise. And that went from a voice object to voltage changes. And that's, of course, is what digital is. That was the first use of digital. Now this was very carefully run by a clock in each station. And the clocks were very, very accurate. Actually, they were more accurate than the standard for the United States, the Navy standard in Washington. But it had to be, they had to be very close, because 600 times a second, they had to be exactly, the records had to be exactly run the way they are. Couldn't deviate at all, except maybe a slight adjustment. And each day, each night, part of the job was to get WWV on the shortwave radio and set our clock so we're all the same throughout the world. Even though there was some deviation, but if we did it all about the same time, we'd be fine for 24 hours. Let's see, what else? Being a sergeant, I was maintained the equipment, ran the equipment. I did not listen in on any conversations because I did not have a need to know. That was the job of the officers. But they would tell us once in a while what had happened. I remember one instant when Mays, the Air Force general, was calling Washington, and he really raised the roof, because his B-29s were grounded, too many of them, because of a small part that they couldn't get out there. And they say he really raised the roof. But this helped, and of course he talked directly to the people there in Washington instead of sending a Twix or a letter or something like that. Instantaneously he got action right away. So that's another good advantage of it. Also understand that General Marshall and Eisenhower used it quite a lot. Now, I don't think MacArthur used it that much, because he's a different kind of general. He was sort of wanted to run his own show. That was pretty obvious all through the war. He was a good general, no question about it, but he didn't use it that much. Although we had one in Brisbane while he was there. And then when he went up to the Philippines, it was installed in Manila, and then it was, I think that's as far as that went. But then there's another one that was put on a barge, so it could follow him, his activity, all the way up the Pacific into Tokyo. And eventually it was installed in Tokyo, taken off the barge, but it was available to him all the time. We also had one in Algiers during the early part of the war, one of the first systems. And where else? Berlin near the end of the war, Frankfurt. Total 12, I'm not sure exactly where they all were. I don't remember anymore. That's 65 years ago, a long time. But
so what were some of your experiences, Warren, that you had great experiences with things that have lasted you really all your life, and you were privy to much that nobody else was involved in, and quite frankly, if you look at the type of thing you were doing, and particularly in that we had broken the codes, particularly the Japanese code, and knew in advance what was happening. We talked about, for example, Yamamoto, and how they knew exactly when he was going to be where, and and those kinds of things. So it must have been pretty exciting in its own way. And then the question I guess I would have for you is, what effect did that have on you, and what did you take from it that you've used in your life?
Well, I was proud. I served my country, and I thought it was an important work I did. And I went on, after the war, I went back to Bell Laboratories and worked on as a trial installation engineer. We were called engineers in that time, not anymore, because you had to be an engineer really to be called an engineer. But I worked on a project, the first microwave from Cape Cod to Nantucket, first test of the Cape microwave, and also the first use of voice frequency signaling, which is what we use now. We just press buttons and we can call somebody across country or any place, and that was because of those tests and the installation Bell Laboratories design. A great company that isn't there anymore, but it's a shame. And I worked there for about 2 years in that program. Then I went to decided I should go get an engineering degree, so I went to Purdue and got my engineering degree. I went back with Western Electric. And most of the time with Western Electric, I was working on Bell Laboratories projects. Bell Laboratories was a design, of course, but they didn't have people to actually go out and test the equipment, because such things as a safeguard program, which is a gigantic thing, at White Sands and Kwajalein Island. So I worked on those quite a bit with the labs. A lot of Western Electric engineers did that. So I left, I retired from Western Electric and was engineering department chief. Our signal from the 6 alley system went to the Army radio people, and of course the radio signal was open in the air, and people wondered why the enemy couldn't intercept or disrupt this program. And we found out that the Germans tried very hard to get it, but figure out what was going on. But the signal was just a steady noise all the time. It didn't change whether his voice was on it or not. But anyway, there's this system for transmitting where they had frequency shifting, and it couldn't interrupt it. And the interesting part about this, the patent was held by that beautiful actress Hedy Lamarr. When she was in Austria, her husband was in munitions supplying to the Nazis, and she didn't like this very much. But anyway, they were working on a system to prevent anybody from interfering with the signal to torpedoes that they were building. And that's where she got the idea, and she came to this country. She left Germany, she didn't like the Nazis, and she became an actress and also an inventor. At the end of the war, the equipment was kept in service till about the spring of '46, and we lost track of each other because of secrecy and so on. We didn't, the fellows, we wrote letters once in a while, but not very often. But in 1975 or 1976, during the Freedom of Information Act, when the secrecy was taken off the Sig Sally system, and it could too, because it didn't need this big thing. It took about 1,000 square feet for the equipment. Now, with a solid state, the whole thing could be sitting on a table. So they gladly gave it up. They didn't keep the secret, but this allowed us to go back to the archives and get some information. Some of the fellows were very interested in it, and